On the morning of the 9th of January, 1922, the undergardener at Blackwood Manor, a man named Thomas Greaves, came into the servants' passage to dry his hands by the range and saw that one of the bells was moving. There were 14 bells on that wall, each one lettered in faded gold on a strip of japanned tin, each one wired through the old house to a separate room. Most of them had not sounded in years. The family had shrunk, the staff had shrunk, and whole floors of the building had gone quiet. But the bell Greaves watched that morning was not one of the everyday bells. It was the third from the left, and the lettering beneath it read Long Gallery. And the Long Gallery had been locked, shuttered, and left to the dust since the autumn of 1919. Greaves stood in the doorway and watched the bell swing on its coiled spring, slow at first, then settling, then still. He said later, when a constable finally took the trouble to write it down, that he had not touched the wire, that no door had opened above, and that the wind that morning was nothing to speak of. He said the house was so quiet he could hear the long case clock ticking 2 rooms away. He said he counted the swings of the bell because he did not know what else to do with himself, and that it rang 11 times before it stopped. He did not go up to look. That is the detail people remember when they hear the story now. A grown man, employed on the estate for 19 years, a man who had buried 2 of his own children and feared very little, did not climb the back stairs to see why a bell was ringing in an empty room. He filled the coal scuttles, he saw to the boiler, and he went home to the cottage at the bottom of the deer park, and he told his wife that he would not be going up to the gallery. Not that day, and not after, and that if the mistress wanted it seen to, she could send for someone from town. That is where this story begins. Not with a scream, not with a storm, but with a quiet man choosing to walk away from a locked room. If you were listening from England, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, or anywhere with an old house near you that the locals still go quiet about after dark, leave the name of the place in the comments below. These cases always seem to live longest in the villages that insist they have forgotten them. Renfold, the parish where Blackwood Manor stands, is one of those places. People there will give you directions to almost anywhere. They will not give you directions to the manor. To understand the bell, and the diary, and the woman whose name was crossed out of the wage book, you have to understand the house. Because at Blackwood Manor, the house is not the setting. The house is the subject. Everything else circles it. Blackwood Manor sits in a wooded fold of land on the Herefordshire side of the Welsh border, above the small village of Renfold, in a valley that the old maps mark as Black Combe. The combe gives the house its name, or the house gives the combe its name, and after 400 years, nobody is entirely sure which way round it went. The core of the building is Jacobean, raised in about 1610 by Sir Edmund Blackwood on the footings of a medieval hall that had stood there since at least the reign of the 3rd Edward. You can still read the join in the stonework if you know where to look. The Jacobean front is tall and narrow, with mullioned windows and twisted chimneys, and behind it the house sprawls backward into the hillside, in a confusion of later additions, a Georgian wing thrown up in the 1760s, when the family still had money, a Victorian service range, and a long, low gallery built onto the south side at some point that no surviving plan records cleanly. That last point matters, so I will come back to it. The long gallery does not appear on the 1841 estate survey. It does not appear on the tithe map. It appears, fully built and furnished, on a household inventory of 1871, and it appears on nothing before that. A building does not simply arrive. Someone built it, someone paid for it, and someone, for reasons we will come to, seems to have preferred that it leave no paper behind. The Blackwoods had been gentry in that valley since before the Civil War, and like a great many families of their kind, they spent the 19th century quietly coming apart. The land was sold off in parcels. Farms that had been held by the same family for 200 years were let go to pay debts. By the time of the old master, Sir Aldous Blackwood, who died in 1909, the estate had shrunk from something over 4,000 acres to fewer than 900, and most of what remained was steep, wet, wooded ground that grew good timber and poor rent. The house by then was too big for the money behind it. Wings were shut up. Rooms were dust-sheeted. The family lived in a fraction of the place their grandparents had filled with servants and light. In the village, the manor was regarded the way villages regard a great house that has stopped being generous, with a kind of wary respect and a long memory for old grievances, and a habit of changing the subject. There were the usual stories, the kind every old house collects, about a gray lady on the back stairs and a sealed room and lights seen where no lights should be. People half believed them and wholly enjoyed them. None of that is the real story. The real story is colder and more particular than folklore, and it begins, as so many of these things do, with grief. But that grief was only the first thing the house refused to explain. The last master of Blackwood Manor, in any real sense, was Major Edmund Blackwood, son of Sir Aldous, born in 1881. He married, in 1907, a young woman named Eleanor Vane, the daughter of a Shropshire clergyman. And by every account that survives, she was clever, reserved, and well-liked. The sort of woman the village expected to bring the old house back to life. For a few years it seemed she might. There was a son, Hugh, born in 1909, the year the old baronet died. There are photographs of the three of them on the south lawn, the gallery windows behind them catching the light. And they look, in those photographs, exactly like a family with a future. Then came the war, and the war did to the Blackwoods what it did to several hundred families like them across the country. Major Edmund Blackwood went out with his county regiment in 1915. He was wounded on the Somme, recovered, went back, and died of his wounds in a casualty clearing station in the spring of 1917. He is buried in France. There is a memorial tablet to him in Renfold Church, and his name is the freshest cut on the war memorial by the Lich Gate. And Eleanor Blackwood was a widow at 33, with a son of 7, and a house she could no longer afford. She might have managed even that. Many did. What broke the family was what came next, and what came next was not a German shell. It was influenza. In the autumn of 1919, in the second great wave of the pandemic that killed more people across the world than the war had, the boy Hugh Blackwood fell ill on a Tuesday and was dead by the following Sunday. He was 10 years old. He is buried in the churchyard at Renfold, in the Blackwood plot, beneath a small gray headstone that gives only his name and his dates and the single word, beloved. With the boy's death, the male line of the Blackwoods of Blackcombe, unbroken since the reign of Elizabeth, came to an end. And this is where the law steps quietly into the story, because the manner of that ending mattered in ways that the village would not have understood, and that the family solicitors understood all too well. The estate was entailed. That is an old legal arrangement, a fee-tail, designed to keep land and house passing down a single male line so that no spendthrift heir could sell the family seat from under his descendants. It had held the Blackwood lands together, more or less, for centuries. But an entail needs heirs, and the entail of Blackwood Manor was tied to the heirs of the body of a Blackwood ancestor. And with Hugh dead and no other male Blackwood living, the entail was on the point of failing entirely. The estate would, in time, fall to a distant and almost theoretical cousin, a branch of the family that had emigrated to Canada 2 generations before, and that nobody at Renfold had ever met. And in the meantime, death duties, what we would now call inheritance tax, had fallen on the estate twice in 2 years, once for the major and once, absurdly, for the child, and the figures the solicitors were dealing with by 1920 were such that the family had no real money at all, only land that could not be sold and a house that could not be kept. This was not unusual. I want to be clear about that, because it is part of why this case sits where it sits. In the years just after the First World War, the great landed estates of England changed hands on a scale not seen since the Norman conquest. whole counties came onto the market. Families who had held their acres for 500 years sold up in a single afternoon at an auctioneer's table, broken by death duties and dead heirs and the collapse of agricultural rents. It is one of the quiet catastrophes of English history, and it happened in the space of about 4 years, and Blackwood Manor was caught in the middle of it. So when the people of Renfold said, later, that the manor had been doomed, they were not entirely wrong. A great many houses like it were doomed in exactly the same years, for exactly the same reasons. What makes Blackwood different is not that it fell. It is what the widow did while it was falling. To understand that, you have to go back to the first owner of the Long Gallery, and to the reason a room was built that the maps refused to record. After her son's death, Eleanor Blackwood changed. The village agreed on that much, though they disagreed on everything else. She had always been quiet. Now she became something more than quiet. She stopped going down to the church, though she continued to pay for its upkeep. She stopped receiving the few visitors who still called. She reduced the household to a skeleton, a cook, a housekeeper, 2 maids, the undergardener Greaves, and a groundsman named Jack Mellor, who looked after the deer park and the timber. And in the spring of 1920, she engaged a companion. A companion in those years was a particular kind of post. It was the situation of a respectable but penniless woman, often unmarried, often of a slightly higher class than a servant, but with no money of her own, employed to keep a wealthier woman company, to read to her, to walk with her, to sit with her in the long evenings. It was a lonely sort of employment, and it tended to attract lonely sorts of women, and the woman Eleanor Blackwood engaged was named Edith Carroway. We know a good deal about Edith Carroway, more than we know about most people who pass through a story like this. And we know it for one reason. She kept a diary. It is that diary, found wrapped in oilcloth in the Long Gallery more than 30 years after she vanished, that gives this case its name, and it is the diary I am going to draw on now, carefully, because it is the only voice we have from inside the house in those final months, and because it is, in places, very strange indeed. Edith Carroway was born in 1893 in Shrewsbury, the daughter of a draper who failed and a mother who died young. She had been a governess, then a companion to an elderly woman in Ludlow who died and left her nothing, and she came to Blackwood Manor in April 1920, aged 27, with 1 trunk and no expectations. Her early diary entries are ordinary and a little sad. She writes about the size of the house, the cold of it, the kindness of the housekeeper, Mrs. Probert, and the silence of the mistress. She writes that Mrs. Blackwood is gentle but far away, that she seems to listen to things in the house that Edith cannot hear, and that the place, for all its grandeur, makes her think of a body that has not yet been told it is dead. That is her phrase. A body that has not yet been told it is dead. She was, whatever else she was, a careful and unusual writer, and that is part of what makes the diary so hard to put down once you start. For the better part of 2 years, her entries describe a quiet, declining life. Walks in the deer park. The state of the roof. The trouble with the chimneys. The mistress's headaches. And then, in the autumn of 1921, the tone of the diary begins to change. And it changes around a single recurring detail. The clock. The long case clock in the Great Hall, an 18th century piece by a Hereford maker, had kept good time for as long as anyone could remember. In November 1921, Edith records that it began to stop. Not at random. It stopped each night at 14 minutes past 2, and was found stopped in the morning, and was wound and set and ran perfectly all day, and stopped again the following night at the same time. She writes that she sat up one night to watch it, and that she fell asleep in the chair, and that she woke at 20 past 2 with the fire dead and the clock stopped at 14 minutes past. and the mistress standing in the doorway in her nightgown, looking not at the clock, but at the door to the long gallery. The public record gives one version of what was happening in that house. The diary suggests another. Edith never explains the time. That is one of the things that has kept people reading the diary for 70 years. She never says what happened at 14 minutes past 2, and there is no document anywhere that tells us. The Major's death was recorded by the hour, not the minute, and it was in France in any case. The boy died in the afternoon. There is no event in the family's history that the time obviously points to. It simply recurs, night after night, in a dead woman's handwriting, with no key. And around it, through the winter of 1921 and into 1922, the other irregularities begin. The candles came next. In December, Edith records that the disused chapel, a small private chapel in the oldest part of the house, unused since before the war, was found with its candles lit. Not one candle. Every candle in the place, on the altar and in the wall sconces, burned down to stubs. The wax pooled and hardened on the stone floor. Mrs. Probert, the housekeeper, found them on a morning when the chapel had been locked, and she had the only key but one, and the other key hung in the mistress's room. Edith writes that Mrs. Probert said nothing about it to anyone but her, and that her hands shook when she told it, and that she asked Edith, plainly, whether she thought the mistress was walking in her sleep. Edith does not record her answer. Then, a name disappeared. Among the household papers that survive, in the Herefordshire County Record Office, is the Blackwood Manor wage book for the years 1919 to 1923, a plain ruled ledger in which the housekeeper entered the staff and their quarterly wages. In the entry for the quarter ending at Christmas 1921, the name of one of the maids, Florence Tranter, is written out and then struck through with a single line of ink, and against it, in a different and smaller hand, is written the word gone. There is no further entry for her. There is no record of her wages being paid out, no character reference written for her, no note of where she went. Florence Tranter, aged 19, of the parish of Renfold, simply stops. The village remembered her as a cheerful, ordinary girl with a sweetheart in Leintwardine. The sweetheart, questioned long afterward, said she had stopped answering his letters in the December of 1921, and that he had assumed she had thrown him over. He never saw her again. Neither, it seems, did anyone else. I want to be careful here, because this is the point at which a story like this can run away from the facts. There is no proof that anything was done to Florence Tranter. Girls in service left posts without notice all the time, particularly from cold and lonely houses, and the word gone in a wage book is not the same as a crime. But Florence Tranter is the first of 2 women to vanish from Blackwood Manor in the space of 2 months, and a single line of ink through a maid's name is a very small mark to carry so much weight. What can be said is that Florence Tranter was looked for, in a small and hopeless way, by the people who loved her. Her mother, a widow in Leintwardine, went up to the manor that spring and was told the same thing the constable was later told, that the girl had given notice and gone, though no one could say where. The mother did not believe it, because her daughter had written to her every fortnight without fail, cheerful, ordinary letters about the cold rooms and the kind cook, and the letters had simply stopped in the December, between one fortnight and the next, with no warning and no farewell. A girl who means to leave a post writes to her mother first. Florence Tranter wrote nothing. The last of her letters, which the mother kept, says only that she did not like the south end of the house and had asked to be moved, and that she would tell her more when she saw her at Christmas. She did not come at Christmas. Her mother kept the letters until she died, and they passed to a niece, and they are quoted, with the family's permission, in the only serious account of the case ever published. And reading them now, knowing what we know, is not a comfortable thing. That detail sat unnoticed in a county archive for decades, until a researcher reading the diary went looking for the wage book and found the 2 of them agreeing. Because in the diary, Edith records the same thing, but from inside the house. She writes that Florence had become frightened in the last weeks before she left, that the girl had asked to sleep in another maid's room rather than her own, and that she had said something to Edith that Edith sets down in the diary in careful, level handwriting and does not comment upon. Florence told her that there was someone in the long gallery, that she had heard them at night through the wall, that it was not the mistress, because the mistress had been in her own room, and that whoever it was had been crying, very softly, for a long time, and had then stopped all at once, as though they had been told to. Edith did not believe her. She says so. She writes that Florence was a nervous, imaginative girl, that old houses make noises, that the wind in the chimneys of a place that sighs can sound like almost anything. And then, 2 pages and several days later, in an entry written in a noticeably worse hand, she records that she has heard it herself. To understand why the long gallery mattered so much, and why a grown man would not climb the stairs to it, you have to go back to the room itself, and to what it held. The long gallery at Blackwood Manor ran the length of the south front, a high, narrow room with windows down one side and the family portraits down the other, generations of Blackwoods looking out across the room at the light. It had been the heart of the house in better days, the place where the family walked on wet afternoons and where they gathered for portraits and parties. It had been shut up in 1919, after the boy died, on Eleanor Blackwood's own instruction. And the reason given at the time was simple and entirely believable. It held the portraits, and among the portraits was the only painting ever made of her son, a small oil of hue at 6 years old, and she could not bear to walk past it. So the gallery was locked, and the key was kept in her room, and the household understood, because grief of that kind needs no explanation. But the diary suggests the sealing of the gallery was not only about the portrait. Edith records that the mistress went into the gallery at night, that she would take the key and unlock the door and go in alone, in the small hours, and that Edith, whose room was along the same corridor, would hear the lock turn, and the door open and close. And then, for an hour or more, nothing, no footsteps, no sound. And then the door again, and the lock and the key returned to its place, and the house quiet until the clock stopped at 14 minutes past 2. Edith writes that she came to dread those nights, not because of what she heard, but because of what she did not. She writes that a person alone in a room will make sounds, will move, will shift a chair or cough or set down a glass, and that the mistress, for an hour at a time, in a locked room, made no sound at all. As though, Edith writes, she were not alone in there at all, but sitting very still, listening, the way one listens in a room where someone else is present, and neither of you wishes to be the first to speak. In late January 1922, the diary records that Edith asked the mistress, directly, what she did in the gallery at night. It is one of the few entries in which she gives anything like dialogue. Eleanor Blackwood, she writes, looked at her for a long moment, and then said only this, that she went in to keep him company, that he did not like to be left, and that Edith was not to go in, ever, under any circumstances, because the room did not care for strangers, and she could not answer for what it might do. Edith took this, reasonably enough, to be the speech of a mother half mad with grief, talking to the portrait of her dead son in the dark. It is the obvious reading. It is probably, in some sense, the true one. But 2 things complicate it. The first is the candles in the chapel, and the bell that rang, and the names struck out of the wage book, none of which a grieving woman talking to a portrait can easily account for. And the second is what happened to Edith Carraway herself, 3 weeks later, on the 11th of February, 1922. The public version of that night is short, because the public was told almost nothing. According to the household, Edith Carraway left Blackwood Manor on the morning of the 12th of February to visit her family in Shrewsbury, and did not return. According to Eleanor Blackwood, who said as much to the rector and, eventually, to a constable, Edith had been homesick and low for some weeks, and had given notice, and had gone home, and there was an end to it. The trouble with that account is that Edith Carraway had no family in Shrewsbury. Her father was dead, her mother was dead, she had no brothers or sisters that any record can find, and the lodgings she had kept in Shrewsbury before coming to the manor had been let to someone else 2 years before. There was no home in Shrewsbury for her to go to. There was nowhere for her to have gone at all. The local paper gives one account. The constable's notebook, when it finally surfaced, gives a colder one. The case, such as it was handled by the Renfold constable, P.C. Albert Yelland, a steady, unimaginative man who covered 3 parishes on a bicycle, and who had no experience whatever of anything resembling a disappearance. His notebook survives in the county record office, and it is a remarkable document precisely because of how little it contains and how carefully it contains it. He went up to the manor on the 17th of February, 6 days after Edith was last seen, prompted by the cook, Mrs. Voss, who had taken her own worries to the village. He spoke to Mrs. Blackwood. He recorded that she was composed, courteous, and entirely consistent. He recorded that she gave the same account she had given the rector. And then, at the bottom of the page, in a smaller hand, as though he had added it later and did not quite want to, he wrote a single line. "The mistress would not let me see the lady's room, nor the gallery. Said the keys were lost. The keys were not lost." Edith Carraway's room was found, when the house was finally entered, years afterward, exactly as she had left it, her clothes in the press, her brushes on the table, her trunk in the corner with her few good things still folded inside it. A woman who has decided to go home to Shrewsbury does not leave her clothes and her trunk and her hairbrushes behind. And the diary in which she had recorded every strange and frightening thing about that house through the long winter, was not in her room at all. It was found, decades later, in the one room she had been forbidden to enter, the long gallery, wrapped in oilcloth and pushed behind the wainscot beneath the portrait of a boy who had been dead since 1919. How it came to be there is one of the questions the case does not answer. There are only bad answers, and I will come to them. The house stood empty of strangers after that. But the story did not end with Edith Carraway leaving, because she had not left. Eleanor Blackwood lived on at Blackwood Manor for another 9 years. The household grew smaller still. The cook left within the 12-month, unwilling to stay. Mrs. Probert, the housekeeper, stayed, out of loyalty or out of something harder to name, until her own death in 1928. By the end, the mistress was alone in the house, but for a daily woman who came up from the village to cook and clean, and who went home before dark and would not stay after, not for any wage. The groundsman, Jack Mellor, stayed longest of the outdoor men, because the deer park and the timber were his life, and he had nowhere else to go. He outlived the mistress, and in his old age he talked, the way old men do, to anyone in the village who would buy him a drink. And one of the things he talked about is in the published account, because a local man wrote it down before Mellor died in 1949. Mellor said that in the last winters, with the house all but empty and the mistress alone in it, he would find footprints in the snow on the south lawn, beneath the gallery windows, on mornings when no one had been out and the gates had been locked from the inside. Small prints, he said. The prints of someone who went barefoot, or near enough, out from the house, and along beneath the windows and back to the house again, and never any further, never to the gate, or the park, or the wood. Only that one short walk beneath the gallery and back, as though whoever made them was tethered to the place, and could go no distance from it. He stopped clearing the snow there, he said. He let it lie. And he never told the mistress, because he had the strong feeling, which he could not explain, that the mistress already knew. Eleanor Blackwood was found dead in her bed on a morning in March 1931 by that Daily woman, and the doctor who certified the death, Dr. William Ferris of Leintwardine, gave the cause as heart failure, which at the age of 47 is the kind of phrase a country doctor used when he meant that a person had simply stopped. Dr. Ferris left a private note, which his family later gave to the record office, and in it he says something he did not put on the certificate. He says that when he was called to the body, the long case clock in the hall was stopped, and that it was stopped at 14 minutes past 2, and that the Daily woman swore it had been keeping good time the day before. He says he found this disquieting and could not say why. He was a sensible man, by all accounts, not given to fancy, and the note is the only place in his long career where he wrote anything of the kind. He ends it with a sentence I find hard to read, without a small cold feeling at the back of the neck. He writes that as he left the house he was certain, against all reason, that he had heard, from somewhere above him, the sound of someone weeping, very softly, and that it stopped all at once, as though it had been told to. That phrase again. As though it had been told to. It appears in Florence Tranter's account, as Edith recorded it in 1921. It appears in Dr. Ferris's note in 1931. The two people who used it never met, and could not have read each other's words, because the diary was sealed behind the wainscot, and the doctor's note was in a drawer in Leintwardine. And yet, they reached 10 years apart for the same image. That is the kind of detail that this case is full of, and it is the kind of detail that no ordinary explanation quite covers. With Eleanor's death, the estate passed, as the entail had always meant it to the distant Canadian cousin, a man named Blackwood who had never seen the place and who wanted nothing to do with it. He instructed agents to sell. And here the wider history of England closes over the Blackwoods entirely, because by 1931, the bottom had fallen out of the market for great houses. The grand sell-offs of the early 20s had glutted it. Nobody wanted a vast, cold, declining manor in a wet Herefordshire combe with 900 acres of steep woodland and no money attached. The house was put up for auction in 1932 and did not sell. It was put up again and did not sell. It sat empty. The auction catalogue from 1932 survives, and it is one of the strangest documents in the whole file. Not for what it says, but for what it does not. It lists the contents of the house room by room, the furniture, the pictures, the plate, the linen, in the dry, exact language of the sale room. It lists the long gallery, it gives its dimensions and notes the paneling and the family portraits. And then, where every other room has an inventory of contents, the long gallery has a single line. Contents not viewed. Rooms sealed at instruction of vendor. The agents who valued every other inch of that house, who counted the very teaspoons, did not go into the long gallery. The instruction came from the Canadian cousin, who had never set foot in the place, and who, when later asked why he had ordered the room left sealed, said that he had not, that he had given no such instruction, that he did not know the room existed. The auction catalogue lists the room. It does not list what was found inside it, because no one would go in to look. The house stood empty through the 30s, decaying gently, the gardens going to wilderness, the deer park grown up in bramble and thorn. And then, the war came again. The Second War. And the Second War did to Blackwood Manor the one thing that fire and auction and decay had not. It put people back inside it. In 1940, like hundreds of empty country houses, Blackwood Manor was requisitioned by the government. For a time it held part of an army training depot, and then, from 1942, it was used as accommodation for a unit whose papers are still not fully open. The men who were billeted there left their own small contribution to the legend, and it is worth setting down because it comes from a quite different kind of witness. Ordinary soldiers, with no reason to invent anything, and every reason to want a quiet billet. Several of them, in letters home and in one later memoir, complained about the south wing, the wing that held the long gallery. They said it was impossible to keep warm, which old houses often are. But they also said, more than one of them, that the men would not sleep in it, that there was a corridor down there nobody used, that a sentry on night duty had reported a bell ringing somewhere in the empty part of the house, and that when the duty officer went to look, he found a row of servants' bells on a wall in the old kitchen passage, all of them still, except that one of them, the third from the left, was very slightly swinging. The officer, a sensible man by his own account, assumed a drought and thought no more of it, until he looked at the lettering beneath the bell and read the words "Long Gallery," and was told by the cook, a local woman who came in to feed the men, that the long gallery had been bricked up since before the First War, and that the wire to that bell had been cut years ago. He checked. The wire had been cut. The bell could not ring. It had, all the same, been moving. That detail had sat in a soldier's letter, unread by anyone who knew the rest of the story, for the better part of 40 years, until a local historian putting the case together found it and set it beside Thomas Greaves and his 11 swinging rings in January 1922. Two men, 20 years apart, in a house full of silent bells, both watching the same bell move on a cut and broken wire. After the war, the army left, and the house, used hard and never repaired, was in a worse state than ever. It passed through 2 or 3 owners through the 50s and 60s, men who bought it cheap with plans to turn it into a hotel or flats or a school, and who sold it on again, quickly having done little or nothing. It is one of the most persistent threads in the whole story, and the most easily dismissed. The later owners did not stay. They came with money and intentions and a builder's confidence, and within a year or two they were gone, and the house was on the market again. And not one of them, in the records that survive, ever said plainly why. They gave reasons that were not reasons. The damp, the cost, a change in circumstances, a wife who did not care for the country, each reason ordinary on its own. All of them together, a pattern. It was during one of these abandoned schemes, in 1953, that the diary was found. A surveyor named Leonard Frith was engaged to examine the house for a buyer who meant to convert the south wing into apartments. Frith's report survives in full, and most of it is exactly what you would expect: dry rot and failed gutters and the price of new lead. But one section of it is not dry at all, and it concerns the long gallery, which by then had been not only locked, but bricked up at both ends. The doorways filled with brick at some point that Frith could not date, and that appears in no building account. He had the brick at one end taken down, because his survey required it, and he was the first person known to have entered the long gallery since Eleanor Blackwood's death 22 years before. What he found, he records carefully, almost reluctantly. The room was as it had been left, the portraits on the walls, the dust thick and undisturbed, the shutters closed. The portrait of the boy Hugh hung where it had always hung. And behind the wainscot beneath it, in a cavity that Frith says looked as though it had been deliberately made, was a bundle wrapped in oilcloth, and inside the oilcloth was a leather-bound diary, the diary of Edith Carraway, the companion who had vanished from that house 31 years before, and who, according to the only account ever given, had gone home to a family she did not have, in a town she had not lived in for years. The diary was hers. There is no doubt about that. It is in her hand, which can be checked against her letters of application, still in the estate papers. It runs from her arrival in April 1920 to an entry dated the 10th of February 1922, the night before she disappeared. And that last entry is the reason this case has never quite been allowed to rest. I am not going to read it to you in full, both because it is hers and because some of it does not make the kind of sense that reading aloud can hold. But I will tell you what it contains. It is written in a hand that has gone bad with fear, the letters large and pressed hard into the paper. She writes that she has decided to leave, that she can no longer stay in the house, that she has given the mistress no notice because she is afraid of what the mistress will say. She writes that the night before, she had at last done the thing she was forbidden to do. She had taken the key from the mistress's room while the mistress slept, and she had gone into the long gallery, alone, in the dark, to see for herself what was kept there. And then the entry stops being an account of the house and becomes something else. She writes that the room was cold in a way that was not the cold of an unheated room. She writes that the portraits were turned, that every portrait in the gallery, generations of them, had been turned to face the wall, except one, the small portrait of the boy, which faced into the room. She writes that she stood in front of it for a long time, and that she became certain, the longer she stood, that the boy in the portrait was not looking out of the painting at her, but at something behind her, in the center of the room, and that she could not make herself turn round to see what it was. The last line she ever wrote, on the 10th of February 1922, is this: "I will set it down as she set it down, and then I will leave it." She wrote, "I know now why she goes in at night, and I know it is not him she keeps company with. And tomorrow I am going to leave this house and never write of it again. And if I am wrong about everything, then no one need ever read this. And if I am right, then God help the next one who turns the key." There is no entry for the 11th. There is no entry for any day after. The diary ends there, and Edith Carraway ends there. And what happened to her between the writing of that line and the wrapping of the diary in oilcloth, and the placing of it behind the wainscot of the very room she meant to flee, no document in any archive will tell you. There is one more witness to set beside the soldiers and the surveyor, and he is in some ways the most careful of all, because he had the most to lose by saying too much. The rector of Renfold through these years was the Reverend Charles Aldington, who held the living from 1911 to 1936, and who knew the family as well as any outsider could. He had buried the boy. He had said the words over the empty space where the major should have lain. He had called at the manor through all the strange winter of 1921 and 1922, in the ordinary way of a country parson, and he was the first person Eleanor Blackwood told that Edith Carraway had gone to Shrewsbury. And among his papers, given to the diocese after his death, is a letter he wrote to his bishop in the spring of 1922, asking, in the most roundabout language imaginable, for guidance. The letter never names the trouble. That is what makes it so hard to read. He writes that there is in his parish a household under a great and particular affliction, that he has been into the house and come away more troubled than he went, that he fears for the soul of the lady of it and cannot say plainly why, and that he has seen, in a room he was shown by accident and was not meant to see, a thing he does not have the words for and would rather not commit to paper, even to his bishop. He asks whether the older offices of the church, the ones the modern age has set aside, are ever still permitted, and in what circumstances, and by whose leave. He is asking, in the cautious, frightened language of an educated man who does not want to be thought a fool, whether he may perform an exorcism. The bishop's reply does not survive. The Reverend Aldington never wrote of it again, in any paper that has come down to us, and he left the parish quietly a few years later for a living in another county. The vicar's letter, like so much in this case, is careful in a way that feels deliberate. Careful in the way a man is careful when he has decided to leave a record, but not to leave himself exposed by it. The solicitors were careful too, and theirs is the last set of documents to weigh. The family's affairs were handled by Messrs. Dauncey and Crowe of Broad Street in Hereford, and a portion of their papers survives in the estate collection. Most of it is the dry business of a dying estate, the death duties, the entail, the endless correspondence with the agents over rents that could not be raised, and farms that could not be sold. But among it is one item that has never been satisfactorily explained. In March 1922, a month after Edith Carraway disappeared, Eleanor Blackwood instructed the firm to draw up a deed that she then lodged with them, sealed, with the instruction that it was not to be opened until 21 years after her death, or until the house passed out of the family entirely, whichever came first. The estate passed out of the family in 1931, on her death, but the sealed packet was somehow overlooked in the upheaval, and it sat in the strong room at Broad Street for decades. When at last it was opened, in the 1950s, in the course of clearing the firm's old business, it was found to contain a single sheet of paper in Eleanor Blackwood's hand, and on it were written only the words of a Latin prayer. The prayer said over the dead, and beneath it, in English, one line. She wrote, "Whoever holds this house, do not unseal the gallery, and do not let it be alone." The county records give the date the deed was lodged. They do not give the reason, and the family papers, as they so often do, stop at the exact point where the story becomes difficult. So what happened at Blackwood Manor? When you have gone through all of it, the diary and the wage book and the constable's notebook and the doctor's note and the soldier's letters and the surveyor's report, you are left, in the end, with 3 explanations, and not one of them is comfortable, and not one of them is complete. The first explanation is the ordinary one, and it deserves to be taken seriously, because ordinary explanations usually turn out to be right. It is that Edith Carraway, a lonely and imaginative woman in a cold and isolated house, in the company of a mistress destroyed by grief, simply lost her nerve and left. That she did go, that February morning, on foot or by carrier's cart, and that she made a new life somewhere under a new name, as a great many women in service quietly did, and that she put her old diary out of reach because she was ashamed of it, of the fear and the fancy in it, and never came back for it. That the bells were draughts, and the candles were the mistress sleepwalking, and the clock was a worn escapement, and the whole edifice of dread is a thing that later readers built on top of a sad and perfectly natural story. It is possible. The only thing it does not explain is why a woman who meant to leave the next morning would hide her diary in the one room she was fleeing, and how it came to be sealed behind the wainscot, and where she went, and why no trace of Edith Carraway, alive, has ever been found, anywhere, after the 10th of February, 1922. The second explanation is the criminal one, and it is darker, and in some ways simpler. It is that Edith Carraway did not leave the house alive, that she went into the long gallery that last night and saw or learned something she was not meant to, and that Eleanor Blackwood, alone, half mad and protecting something, made sure she did not carry it out of the house. That the same is true of Florence Tranter, the maid who heard weeping through the wall and whose name was struck from the wage book with the word gone. That the sealed gallery, the bricked-up doorways, the room that no surveyor's valuer would enter, the contents not viewed, are sealed for the oldest reason in the world, which is that something was put in there that was never meant to come out. It is the explanation the village half believed and never said, and it fits the facts better than the first, and it has one great hole in it, which is that the house was searched, eventually, more than once, by people looking for exactly this, and nothing was ever found. No remains, no grave. 2 women vanished from Blackwood Manor, and the house, when it was finally taken apart, gave neither of them back. And then there is the third explanation, which is the one nobody who handled this case was ever willing to write down in plain words, and which I am only going to gesture at, because it is not the kind of thing that belongs in a coroner's report or a constable's notebook, and because the moment you say it plainly, it sounds like the cheap thing this story has spent 9,000 words refusing to be. It is the explanation that Edith Carraway herself was reaching for in that last entry, when she wrote that it was not the boy the mistress kept company with. It is the explanation suggested by a clock that stopped at the same minute for 10 years and stopped again at that minute on the morning its mistress died, by a bell that rang on a cut wire, twice 20 years apart, by a phrase, as though it had been told to, used by two witnesses who never met, by a room that arrived on no map and left on no plan, and that even its legal owner did not know existed. It is the explanation that says the house was not the place where the thing happened. It is the explanation that says the house was the thing. That whatever was kept in the long gallery was older than Eleanor Blackwood, and older than her grief. That she did not seal the room to hide what she had done, but to contain what was already there. And that she went in at night, not because she was mad, but because someone has to keep it company, and because, when there is no one left, the house finds the next one who turns the key. I am not asking you to believe that. I am only telling you that of the three explanations, it is the one that leaves nothing out, and that the other two each leave something out, and that this is precisely the shape of the cases that never close. Blackwood Manor still stands, after a fashion. The conversion of 1953 came to nothing, like all the others. The surveyor Leonard Frith finished his report, handed in the diary to the local police, who, with two women 30 years dead and no body and no suspect living, quietly filed it. And the buyer who had meant to make apartments withdrew his offer and bought a house in a different county. The diary passed, in time, to the county record office, where it sits today, and where you may read it, under supervision, if you can give a reason. The house was never sold for conversion. It was fenced off in the 1970s as a danger to the public, the south wing roof having partly fallen in, and it is fenced off still. It appears on the modern Ordnance Survey map as a small gray rectangle with the words Blackwood Manor in the upright lettering reserved for buildings, and beneath that, in italics, the single word ruins. The portraits are still inside. That is the detail that I find I cannot quite leave. When the south wing roof came down, it came down over the long gallery, and the room is open now to the weather, and no one has been into it since. Because there is no longer a safe way in, and no reason anyone can give for wanting to go. So the Blackwood portraits, 400 years of them, sit in a roofless room in a sealed house in a wood that the village will not walk through after dark, with the rain coming in on them, slowly turning to nothing. All of them facing the wall. Except one. In the autumn of last year, the company that now holds the land sent a man up to the house to survey it once more, for a scheme to make the timber safe and the ruin stable. He did not go inside. The report he filed is brief and entirely professional, concerned with structure and access and the cost of clearing the fallen roof. But there is a single sentence at the end of it, the kind of sentence that men put at the end of reports when they want it on the record and do not want to be asked about it. He wrote that as he was leaving, in the last of the light, he heard a bell, that it came from inside the house, from the old servants' passage, where the row of Japan bells still hangs rusting on the wall, that he counted, because he did not know what else to do with himself, and that it rang 11 times before it stopped,